Roxo Media House.
A Signal 51 is police code for an investigation, a law enforcement proceeding that is a systemic and thorough attempt to learn the facts about a possible crime that is complex and whose facts and circumstances are generally hidden, at least initially, behind obstacles that can be coincidental and or man-made. Investigations methods are formal. I'm John Henry, a journalist. My partner is Jake White, a retired Fort Worth police sergeant. And together we examine the difficult cases of law enforcement, both in Fort Worth and around the region. This is Signal 51. The show is designed specifically for a more mature audience. Some of the content is graphic and is not intended for younger audiences. This week on the Signal 51 Chronicles, Bloody 1991. In the year 1986, Fort Worth witnessed the worst year on record for homicides. 200 killings in a city that had never suffered more than 128 in a single year before. The 1986 bloodletting was inexplicable to Fort Worth detectives, but they easily dismissed it as a macabre statistical fluke, unlikely to plague the city again. And sure enough, the next year, the body count fell back to 135, and to only 98 a year after that, in 1988. Fort Worth's homicide rate rose the next 2 years, but only minimally. Nothing to prepare the homicide unit for what would come in 1991. The first body fell outside a near Southside bar a minute after midnight on New Year's Day. The second, inside a similar nightclub only a few hours later. On the average of one every other day, the name of a new victim was added to the green chalkboard on the third floor of the police department downtown, where homicide detectives kept a running tally. And in 1991, Fort Worth's second bloodiest year on record to that time, when more than 7 killings and 10 happened in the struggling neighborhoods of South and Southeast Fort Worth, when the vast majority of victims are young black men, no slang could be more typical than Joby Johnson's December 6th murder. Police said the argument between Johnson and his friend Marlon Coleman was over drugs, as such fatal quarrels so often are. Coleman wanted his money for the crack cocaine he gave Johnson. Johnson didn't have it and was said to have smoked the drugs himself. The dispute continued past midnight, ending on the front lawn of Coleman's Burdell Street home. "Shoot me, man," Johnson cried then, according to Coleman's statement later to police. "You think I'm scared to die? Shoot me. Shoot me." Coleman told police he raised a .38 caliber revolver that he borrowed and had been carrying at his side, his finger on the trigger. The gun exploded and Johnson groaned, staggered, and fell backward. When police found him, he was lying face up, staring into the sky as if stargazing, his dull stare fixed on a point deep into the wild beyond. Coleman left and called his mother in distress, remorseful at what he'd done. In 1991, some died that year as they had lived, dancing dangerously on the edge with drugs or embracing the ruinous lifestyle of gangs. Others fell victim to fate, being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person. They owned businesses or served fast food. They dropped out of high school or graduated from college. They peddled drugs, guns, and sex, or provided meals, comfort, and goodwill. They brought the mail and took out the trash, collected cans for cash, and sold physical fitness. When last seen alive, they were celebrating their birthdays at bars or checking their businesses for signs of gang activity. They were at work or running across a parking lot for cheap sodas. They were holding guns on people or hauling out dope for sale. They were washing their cars or pouring a foundation for an added room. And then there was the case of Lady Gallagher, 84, frail from health issues and age. She was beaten to death as she lay in bed on Christmas Eve. Said her granddaughter 5 years after her death, "It's been years and here we are left hanging. It felt like they knew who did it, but they didn't have enough evidence. It seems like yesterday. Lady was, quote, the rock in my family that kept me from going who knows where," the granddaughter said, focusing on the unanswered questions of who and why could have consumed her life.
Lady Gallagher, at 84, was described as a compassionate but strong-willed, an 80-pound woman who refused to give up her small apartment in the 3300 block of Bel Air Drive. to move into a nursing home despite infirmities that left her crippled and half blind. Quote, "She did it her way," said a close friend, "but it was her undoing. She was so helpless." Family members said Gallagher could not have put up much of a fight. In addition to her frail body frame, she also used a wheelchair and a walker to get around. Relatives said Gallagher had lived in the TCU area for about 5 years and was planning to move to a retirement home. A friend said she drove Gallagher home around 9 p.m. after a family Christmas gathering at her home. Once active in church and civic affairs, Gallagher had been in frail health in recent years, losing an eye in a fall and earlier suffering a broken hip that kept her mainly confined to the wheelchair. Relatives said Gallagher stubbornly refused to move to a nursing home in recent years, saying she wouldn't give up her familiar possessions or her independence. A grandmother of 5 and a great-grandmother of 2, Lady had survived her husband Burton and her 2 adult children. Quote, "She was ready," said a relative. "She was just tired. She had a full life and was in poor health, and she wanted to die. She said so. She didn't want to go to a nursing home. She dreaded that. She's at peace now." Said another friend, "When you are sick that long, there's nothing happy about it, but not like this." Relatives and friends don't believe the killing was random. Quote, "We're just all shocked. She was defenseless. I just can't get over how someone could beat a defenseless woman like that. This is a case for a public execution if there ever was one." Said a friend, "She was not able to get around. She was totally dependent on her help and family. She was crippled. Basically, she sat in a chair and would be taken into the kitchen when it was time to eat. She was very formal. She wouldn't eat in front of the TV." Lady was born Lady Key in Tennessee to a family that traced its ancestry back to Francis Scott Key, the 19th century lawyer who wrote the words to the Star-Spangled Banner. After attending the University of Tennessee, she married Burton M. Gallagher, an electrical engineer, with whom she moved to Fort Worth in 1946. The first name describes her exactly, Lady, said a Texas utility spokesman who worked with Gallagher's husband at Texas Electrical Supply Company, TU's predecessor. "She was a beautiful lady in every aspect. When you think of someone gracious and caring for others, that's how I remember her." Gallagher was a member of the Fort Worth Women's Club and St. Stephen's Presbyterian Church. During the 1950s, she was instrumental in managing the church's nursery as a volunteer. Lady was a very giving and caring person, but very strong-willed, said a friend. That's why she lived in the apartment, refused to go to a nursing home. She was very Christian, but very fun too. She liked to play bridge and have a cocktail. Police say the body was found by a woman hired to make daily checks on Gallagher. The woman told police that she found the door to Gallagher's 2-bedroom condominium partially opened around 9 a.m. She found Gallagher's body on the bed. She had been beaten with some type of blunt instrument. There were no signs of sexual assault or anything related along that line at the initial point of the investigation, a police spokesman said. Police didn't believe robbery was the motive in the slaying. Investigators have not determined whether entry into the apartment had been forced, the detective added. Maybe somebody had broken in and was planning on a burglary and didn't realize that the woman was awakened by their coming in, the police spokesman speculated. A TCU student who lived next door to Gallagher's condo said he didn't hear any disturbances the night of the murder. The student and other neighbors said it was difficult to hear through the thick walls of the older condominium complex. Police have never solved the murder of Lady, whose killer walked free. That the perpetrator is likely dead or in a jail today for some other offense is no consolation for the family of Lady, whose demise requires a full accounting. The body of Kevin Hood, age 22, was found in the 2600 block of Quail Road near the west shore of Lake Arlington on October 1st, 1991. Hood had been shot in the head and robbed. and his light blue 1979 Chevy Malibu was taken. The car was later located near the intersection of John T. White Road and East Loop 820. Kevin was a school bus driver for Fort Worth ISD. Kevin was last seen in the area where his car was found the previous night with another man. That person of interest was an African American man in his late 20s with medium-length curly hair. He was about 6'3" and weighed 250 pounds. He was wearing a brightly colored shirt and had a large gold medallion around his neck and a baseball cap, police were told. On January 21st, 1991, officers were dispatched to a reported robbery at the Rosalind Shoes business at 5724 Locke Avenue. They entered the business and found Rosalind Rubin on the floor. She had sustained blunt force trauma to her upper body. Rosalind Rubin was transported to the hospital. She survived her injuries, but her case was investigated by the homicide unit due to the nature of the crime and the severity of her injuries. On June 17, 1991, Doyle Stanley and John Maddox were found deceased in their apartment. They died as a result of blunt force injuries. They lived together at the apartment. On November 22, 1991, Richard Garcia was at a party that was being held at the residence at 1826 May Street. He and other individuals were outside the house. A car pulled up to the house. One of the males in the car began arguing with one of the males outside of the house. Richard Garcia was shot and killed. All of these cases went cold. Quote, families have a hard time with closure when the person is still out walking around. When I call and let a family know that an arrest has been made, there's usually just silence on the other end of the phone, said David Sears, a homicide detective for Fort Worth. Quote, I don't think they get the satisfaction out of it that they thought they would.
For every one of those higher profile killings, like ladies, there are 10 deaths like Joby Johnson's, drug-related slayings in poverty-ridden neighborhoods that seem to get buried deeper and deeper inside newspapers, or what's left of newspapers. Joby, another of those murdered in 1991, was 23 at the time of his death. Word on the street was that Johnson, only a few months out of jail for selling cocaine, had been smoking another man's crack that he was supposed to be selling. That sin can be a capital offense in this Fort Worth neighborhood known as Stop 6. Johnson was shot once in the chest. Marlon Coleman, 19 at the time, surrendered to authorities after his brother called police and said the teenager had killed someone during a drug deal gone bad. Based on a statement Coleman gave to police, officers went to his home in the 1600 block of Burdell Street, where they found Johnson lying in the front yard. He had been shot once in the chest. Coleman told police the shooting was an accident that occurred when he and Johnson, whom he called a friend, were, quote, playing around. Coleman said he was holding a gun, and Johnson said, quote, shoot me. And the suspect pointed the gun at Johnson, and, quote, it just went off accidentally, according to a police report. Coleman, though, told his brother a different story, and investigators soon weren't buying this accident story. The suspect's brother called police about 3 a.m. from their mother's home, saying his brother had told him and his mother that he had shot and killed someone and wanted to turn himself in. According to the brother, Coleman told him that Johnson had, quote, messed him out of some money and that they got into an argument over it. That is when Johnson told the suspect to shoot him, and Coleman did, according to the police report. After the shooting, Coleman said he drove Johnson's car around, ran out of gas, got more gas, and then drove toward Lancaster. Somewhere en route to his mother's house, he told police, he threw the .38 caliber revolver out of the window. The medical examiner arrived and crime scene work began. Johnson's body was photographed where it fell headfirst down a slide embankment. The investigator, wearing latex gloves, worked quickly by flashlight, pulling a diamond stud from Johnson's ear and food stamps and a single dollar bill from the victim's pockets. Layers of the dead man's clothing were peeled away to reveal a harmless-looking purple blemish on the left side of his chest. That was the entrance wound. A second mark dotted the middle of his back, where the bullet emerged after doing its deadly work. The single silver projectile sparkled in the flashlight glare, where it had come to a rest in Joby's t-shirt. While this was going on, Coleman was said to have been sleeping peacefully in the back seat of a patrol car. It was only a matter of hours that the last piece of this drama would be dispensed with, when a detective fetched Coleman from his jail cell downtown. The only thing you can possibly have in your favor is to cooperate, the homicide detective told him. You need to tell us the full story so somebody isn't going to be putting a story on you, they told him. Marlon Coleman fessed up to the whole deal. Unlike Lady Gallagher's case, this was a mercifully tidy one, wrapped up quite easily. All that's left of Joby is him in another time and place, pictured as an innocent little boy, a sweet kid his family would attest. Said his aunt, I could stand up and witness he was a sweet kid. There was, of course, another side to him as he grew up. Said his younger brother at the time, I knew when he died he was going to get killed. It wasn't going to be no accident. He was either going to get killed or kill someone else. He wasn't no pushover. He would always be fighting. Fighting his life. It's what we do. Joby had been shot, beaten, and run over before, all in separate incidents, and he hadn't died, his brother said. It was merely his time, the brother said. Now, Jake, as we bring it back to Lady Gallagher, you put your police goggles on and you found a trend in 1991.
Seems like it. Now, this comes on the heels, if you remember, several years ago in the counties to our east, one directly to our east and one to the northeast, the case of Billy Shamir.
I don't remember that one. Enlighten us.
So Shamir, I'm going off of memory, but he would pose as a some kind of healthcare worker and would go to these assisted living type facilities, retirement home type facilities, and his target victim seemingly were elderly female, because he was 40, I believe he was 49 when he was ultimately arrested. But he could easily overpower them. Mm-hmm.
No resistance, easy marks.
Easy marks. And he would go in there, steal the jewelry. But Shamir was indicted on 22 counts of capital murder. That's killing a lot of people, right?
That's something Henry Lee Lucas would have attested to back in his day, which they found he didn't kill that many people.
Yeah. Now the Shamir thing, I know he's been convicted on one or two, maybe a few more than that. He's not going to face charges on all 22 of them. But that got me thinking, right? Lady Gallagher, the elderly lady I'm going to say this now, at the most cursed intersection in our city.
We seem to think so.
That's another trend we're onto.
Let's discuss that briefly.
Laura Lee Crane, 70 in her 70s,
late 70s, I believe.
Late 70s,
abducted at the Tom Thumb grocery store there on Hewlin and Bel Air.
13 years after Lady Gallagher, 2004.
20. Godly, it is 13 years. Okay.
Yeah, that's when you know you're getting old.
All right.
When you process the 90s into 2000s, and it seems a lot longer.
13 years after.
13 years later. Obviously, Colin Davis.
The Colin Davis thing happened.
Just down the road.
Yep.
Mere blocks.
Yep.
Nikki Blahitka.
Around the corner there on Bel Air.
Right down the road. Less
than a mile. Maybe about a mile.
Yeah, maybe about a mile.
Yep.
Nonetheless, on Bel Air, basically. Pamela Laughlin getting reportedly dropped off at that same intersection.
She escaped there. It turns out that she was dropped off there, probably, but no, she claimed she had escaped there at that Exxon.
Yeah.
Who she knew the owner of that Exxon at the time.
That's right. I remember that. all of which were cases that just we covered. We haven't been searching for crimes at the intersection of Hewlin and Bel Air.
No, we've stumbled over them.
We just stumble on these. So one of the other things, and you touched on it at first. So the late 80s, early 90s, height of crime, the crack cocaine epidemic, which was at the center of much violent crime. There's no disputing that.
You've lived that your life in your professional career.
Yeah, but it was almost completely... Crack was really, really big early in my career.
Yeah.
I don't want to say it's non-existent now, but it's nothing in comparison to what it was. It's all been replaced with meth and fentanyl.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you. Meth and fentanyl.
Yeah.
All right.
All of it has. I mean, there's still some out there.
But right quick, that's still, drugs is still very much a source of violent crime.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, yeah, big time. So with Gallagher, though, so 195 homicides in 1991, just in Fort Worth. By the end of 90, or at the start of 90, 91. So 1991, 195 homicides in Fort Worth.
Mm-hmm.
At the start of 1992, there were still 52 of them that were unsolved. Okay?
52.
That were unsolved.
All right.
Now, here's kind of a weird trend. Gabriel Diaz, 49. Not saying 49's old. I'm almost there. You're surpassed that.
Thanks for telling everybody that.
But he was found shot in his apartment, 1901 Hewlin. Not extremely far from Gallagher. The motive, the body was found in the residence. That was the motive listed. Go down to Cody Brown. Cody Brown was 74 years old. He was a retired apartment maintenance worker. He was beaten and shot in his apartment at 3846 Stall Cup, opposite side of town. The motive was his body was found in the residence. Could have been anything. We go down to George Keith. He, too, was found at a West Side location. 86-year-old man found with head injuries at 3908 Calmont. Motive, random violence. So I think when you look at these...
81-year-old woman.
Well, so there is Zelly Conley, the 81-year-old. She died 5 years after being attacked in 1986.
Right. I'm looking at the wrong thing.
But nonetheless, you're looking at another 81-year-old lady who was found beaten. I mean, she did die 5 years later, but it was as a result of that attack. Her body was, the motive is described as her body was found in the residence.
So we had two other elderly gentlemen that died in 1991.
Yeah, and then another one. The wild card in this may be the Gabriel Diaz. He's not elderly by any stretch of the imagination, but it's fairly close to Gallagher. So that leads to we have to dig in. What about in 1988, 89, 90, 92, 93? Because when you look at this Gallagher case, how ruthless do you have to be to beat an 84-year-old lady confined to a wheelchair, blind in one eye?
Mm-hmm.
How
somebody could have walked, if it was robbery, somebody could have walked in there, stolen whatever they wanted.
with zero resistance?
With zero resistance.
Because keep in mind, 1991, she didn't have a cell phone.
Right.
She's got to get to the phone hung up on the wall or, wherever. They could have gotten whatever they wanted to.
Yeah.
You've got to be, you're a stone cold killer at that point. If you're doing that to an 84-year-old lady, regardless. But I think it takes a different mindset. And it goes back to like that Shamir Mir case. His targets are elderly people because they were seemingly easy targets for him.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just kind of a fluke deal that he got caught. If I remember correctly, a lot of his were maybe mistaken because when it is an older person, if they're found smothered, there's probably not significant trauma. So who's to say they just didn't stop breathing? They just died, right?
How did police break that case? Do you remember off the top of your head?
If I remember, there was a victim in her 90s She had told police that someone had basically pushed his way into an apartment called the Parkview Elderly Assisted Living Facility in Frisco, and he attempted to smother her with a pillow and stole some jewelry. He was wearing gloves. There were some suspicious person calls near there where I think the police identified Shamir Mir. I think they, if I'm not mistaken, they initiated surveillance. They kind of put two and two together, which led to his apprehension. I don't remember the exact details. I mean, it was good old fashioned detective work. I know that. Mm-hmm. I don't know if there was any of the modern day crime solving things, cell phone locations and, I mean, heck, even cars now. I mean, your car, for example. I mean, so a lot of those have the ability to say, well, you were parked right here. I don't remember exactly. I just remember, like I said, the only thing with the Shamir Mir thing is the victim's age. Was it the exact same thing? I mean, do we know that none of Gallagher's jewelry was missing? The hard thing is we're, 32 years later, more than likely, suspect is dead. Mm-hmm. More than likely, and like you mentioned, suspect is dead, maybe in prison. But were there more? And that's what we need to look into. Were there more elderly women, more than likely in the same geographic area? If you're going from 86 to, just go back 5 years and fast forward 5 years.
But I mean, you're proffering that it's possible that there was a serial killer.
Yeah.
Targeting elderly people.
And here's why. Now, that could be way off base.
Sure.
Could it have been random? It could have been. But I think it's unlikely. It's unlikely that somebody possesses the mindset to kill her. And that's the most heinous act they've ever committed. Again, most of these ones that in 1991, their drug deals gone wrong, their gang violence. There's violence that's interwoven into the murders.
Yeah.
Gallagher's, there is no known violence interwoven into it.
No.
It's a classic. I mean, it's a true whodunit. I don't know, obviously crime scenes and evidence collection and things like that were significantly different. So who knows what exists? Who knows if there is anything? We
had that case a couple of years ago with Carla Walker, right? That was solved through DNA evidence. She was the Western Hills student who was abducted and murdered. They found her body a few days after her abduction, and the case went cold for 47 years, I think. And they found the perpetrator through DNA evidence.
Uh-huh.
Going back to what you just said about, it's unlikely whoever did this to Lady did it only one time. It seems odd also that it's unlikely that the guy convicted of Carla Walker's murder did that just one time, right?
Yeah, because look at all, you have the town center girls from 75 around the same time.
74, same year.
Same year. Here's Lady Gallagher 20 years earlier. We have another similar case. The death of J. Harry Wynn, the garbage crusader, elderly man. Now, robbery more than likely was the motive in that one because they found his car in the stockyards.
Yeah. And his wallet, I think, too. Empty wallet.
Still unsolved.
Yeah. From 19, that same, it was the same year, too, I believe.
I'm going to look up. I wonder how many cold cases.
1974.
So Fort Worth PD doesn't have any cold cases listed in 74. They've got 2 in 71, 3 in 77, 2 in 78, 1 in 79. 1979, Ruth Peters, 76 years old, 3732 Winthrop, not extremely far from Hewlin and Bel Air. A neighbor went into Ruth Peters' apartment and found her deceased in the apartment. She died as a result of a stab wound. Ruth Peters lived alone in the apartment. You've got the case of Eleanor Stark a few years prior to that. 1977, a neighbor found the body of Eleanor Stark in her residence at 3317 Avenue H. It was apparent someone had broken into the residence. She died as a result of trauma to the head. You go to, let's fast forward to the 2000s. You've got Connie Romero, 76 years old, found deceased in her West Fort Worth home. She died as a result of blunt force trauma. She lived alone at the house. She died at 4400 Fletcher. Guess what? That's not far at all from Hewlin and Bel Air. You've got the case of L.J. Robinson, 83 years old. It's known as Pops. He was found deceased in his apartment on Avenue G. He died of blunt force trauma. It seemed to be robbery as the motive. Opposite side of town, but the victim's age, very similar. And then in the 90s, when we look at those, we obviously have Lady Gallagher. I think we've got Felicita Olguin, 1994. She was found deceased in her residence at 1125 May Street. She had been strangled. You got the case of Doris Turner, an 80-year-old male at 614 South Freeway. He was found dead inside of his residence by a friend who came to visit him. He lived alone. This one, I remember this one. You've got 69-year-old John Mitchell and Mary Mitchell, 65. They're on 2200 Hurley. Officers responded to the residence at 2204 Hurley on a report of a double homicide. The officers entered the residence and observed the bodies of John and Mary Mitchell inside the house. Mary and John Mitchell died as a result of blunt force trauma. John and Mary Mitchell lived alone in the residence. I don't know. I mean, there's the common themes, the age, they live alone, the blunt force trauma. I mean, it's possible. I'm not, we don't know that for sure.
No, of course not.
I mean, they could all be a random acts of violence, but they might not be.
I wonder, tell us a little bit about the cold case unit. I know that's not your specialty and you might not necessarily know, but what's the protocol? Maybe is the right word. How do they reactivate a case that's gone cold? Because a lot of these cold cases are just sitting back there collecting dust, right? I mean, they're not actually working these cases as we sit. I
think there's so many of them.
Right.
That would be hard. The evidence is deteriorated or there is no evidence. I think that, again, not my forte, but I would think that where there are cases where evidence does exist, they probably are constantly trying to get DNA hits on that.
Right.
Match them up that way. They're going to get calls repeatedly. You could have deathbed confessions. I mean, there's a number of things that could spur the interest in one case.
Mm-hmm.
Carla Walker is a good example. I don't know what initiated that, but it was obviously a DNA hit on a piece of evidence, which also I think is kind of 50, almost 50 years later, they preserved evidence enough to maintain the integrity of that DNA. I think that's, but it's time consuming as well.
Yeah. I mean, they don't have the manpower resources to,
to
actually work these cases.
Not even close.
So like on the case of Lady Gallagher, I haven't the slightest idea, but what does it take to go open her box and see, wonder if we have any DNA evidence in this particular case? They're not going through all those cold cases looking for DNA evidence.
Well, I think they're always working leads, like hot leads on cold cases, maybe.
Yeah. I see what you did there.
That was a pretty good play on words, wasn't it? I like that. I think that if they had time, if they had resources, if they had personnel, sure, they probably could. It's impossible.
Right.
I know they're clearly doing the best they can. I mean, they're still solving cold cases, but you look at Gallagher, what if there is nothing?
Well, there might not be.
Right? I mean, maybe if she was in fact beaten, maybe there was something on her, on her clothes, on her bed, maybe there was an instrument. But again, we're talking.
I don't believe she was sexually assaulted.
No,
that never appeared in any of our research.
No. There really is probably not much evidence with it. But again, I go back to look at BTK.
Yeah, explain BTK.
The bound, torture, kill.
Is that Kansas City?
Bind, torture, kill. No, Wichita.
Wichita, Kansas. Okay.
Look at how long he killed for.
How long did he kill for?
Let's see, 20, 30 years.
Okay.
He had a long run. So he started in the 70s, and the early 2000s is when he sent the letter to the media. That's ultimately, or to the police or whatever the case was.
Yeah, that's how they
ended up catching him, was based on, I think he sent him some kind of like an old floppy disk or something, and they were able to get the metadata off there and trace it back to the church computer. But it's, I don't know. I mean, again, we're looking at, 20, 30 years worth of history, and these are just some of the cold cases. These are not all of the cold cases by any stretch of the imagination that we just rattled off the website.
Right.
So, with Gallagher, though, again, I think that you have to explore that possibility.
We need to get out of here.
Yeah.
Let's shut her down.
We're shutting this one down. We need to do some more digging into this one. We need to do some more digging into the idea of, was there somebody else out there? Or is there somebody else still out there?
Could be. You never know.
Nope.
All right, we'll see you guys later.
All right.
Roxo Media House.